You ever stop and realize how fragile all this is? Wouldn't take much to throw us right back into barbaric times. All you'd have to do would be eliminate electricity.
New York, one of the biggest cities in the world, plunges into darkness in the blink of an eye. It's just after 4 p.m. on August 14th, 2003, and an unthinkable disaster becomes reality. A cascade of power failures shuts down electricity in southeast Canada and across 8 northeastern states. Cities like New York are brought to a complete standstill. Hundreds of people are trapped in subway tunnels, while the traffic above becomes a nightmare of gridlock. In all, 55 million people lost power for up to 2 days. The main culprit, a sagging high-voltage power line in northern Ohio that brushed up against an overgrown tree.
Eliminate electricity. That's all. But completely. So, no electricity, no lights. You're back to candles and lanterns, campfires and bonfires. Batteries couldn't be recharged. Generators couldn't be refueled because fuel is pumped electrically. So is water, by the way. So no lights, no fuel, no water, no computers. And computers run everything. Police wouldn't help you. They'd be gone at the first sign of trouble. They'd be home protecting their own families. So would the Army and the National Guard. You'd be alone. You'd be on your own. You'd be SOL and JWF.
There's a weird calmness about this hearing. This is not calm. The Russians are already in the grid. This is not a threat. This is happening. We are under attack. We are in a very dangerous place. I just think this has to be an emergency, an urgent situation.
What would the catastrophic consequences be at a human level if you tried to live in a non-electricity world given the way we built our civilization?
9 out of 10 of us wouldn't make it if an attack on the grid resulted in the power going out and staying out for a year.
The veil between civility and brutality is razor thin. So imagine what will happen if there is no food, no power, and no money, and no transportation for 3 weeks, 3 months. Only people with guns and the boldness to go and take what they need to survive will live.
Texas's grid collapse, which should serve as a cautionary tale for everybody else in the United States. Filed over 200 different filings with the federal government related to protecting the electric grid. We had 210 fatalities as a result of that grid collapse. We had millions of people under boil water orders because the water was unsafe. 3 days after the blackout, I took pictures of the empty shelves. There's no water, no bread, no frozen pizza. We were literally minutes away from the blackout causing such severe damage that it could have taken weeks or longer to get the grid back up and running.
Our top story, 4 minutes and 37 seconds. That's how close Texas was from a total power grid collapse last week. It was confirmed today at the ERCOT board meeting.
And again, the question I'd ask, what have we've taken it seriously, what have we actually done other than literally admire the problem?
Extra high voltage transformers are huge. They're hundreds of tons each. You have to shut down a freeway to deliver them. And you have to move stoplights and power lines and streetlights just to get them down a road through a city to get them delivered to the installations. In a grid down situation, there's just going to be no chance of getting extra high voltage transformers on site and installed.
Our chief vulnerability are these big transformers. And if you lose them, you've basically lost the whole grid. And they're not manufactured in this country anymore. You're talking about 18 months to replace one transformer. And this country can't survive for 18 months. It probably can't survive for 6 months without electricity.
We knew about 300 large Chinese transformers that we had imported into the United States. And we knew that at least 200 of those were embedded in the electric grid. They're doing a marketing job. They're underselling other sources, why isn't there a requirement that somebody check to see whether it has some kind of a backdoor, some type of a vulnerability? And there's no requirement that you check it.
Energy official claims an attack on an American power grid was terrorism.
The attack was the most significant incident of domestic terrorism involving the grid that has ever occurred in the U.S.
It's an unprecedented and sophisticated attack on a grid substation.
For 1 a.m., someone cut telephone cables near the substation. About a half hour later, multiple gunmen quickly fired dozens of shots at 17 transformers inside the perimeter of the station. 15 minutes later, transformers began to fail. But officials managed to avoid serious disruptions by rerouting power.
The U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission investigated the incident and concluded, with the aid of a U.S. Navy SEALs team, that this was probably a terrorist attack.
Recently, we saw another one in Arizona. Diesel fuel set to a timer, ready to blow. It doesn't need to be sophisticated because, unfortunately, a lot of these systems were put together in the 70s and the 80s.
So far, none of those attacks have resulted in widespread power outages. Otherwise, well, you might have heard about it. But their frequency has raised concerns about the security of this obviously vital piece of our infrastructure.
This attack did happen, but you didn't hear a peep out of the utility whose substation was attacked.
Ian Wellinghoff was chairman of FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, a small government agency with jurisdiction over the U.S. high-voltage transmission system. Wellinghoff commissioned a study to see if a physical attack on critical transformers could trigger cascading blackouts.
It was actually a very shocking result to us that there's a very few number of substations you need to take out in the entire United States to knock out the entire grid.
Knock out the entire grid?
That's correct.
How many would it take to knock out putting the entire country in a blackout?
Less than 20.
The report was leaked to the Wall Street Journal. It found the U.S. could suffer a coast-to-coast blackout if saboteurs knocked out just 9 substations.
Metcalf took place in 2013, and so immediately there was a call for there to be some type of a physical security standard to protect the electric grid. Unfortunately, that never really materialized. In 1981, GAO came out with a report about how inadequate the physical security of the electric grid was. Here we are talking now, 40 years later, about the exact same thing.
Hacking is part of a cyber attack. It is a way to get into a system, and then you can do all sorts of things. You can sleep in that system if you've hacked into it. You can lay dormant for years and monitor critical information that's being transmitted back and forth. You can get a game, if you will, of how to get the system debilitated by watching it play out in its normal functions. There are a lot of things that happen as a result of hacking.
The real danger is that our infrastructure, in particular our electric power grids, are as vulnerable to cyber attack as the thousands upon thousands of businesses, companies, government agencies that have already been hacked over the last few months and even the last couple of years.
We've had these recent cyber attacks, like SolarWinds and the Colonial Pipeline and the attacks in the meatpacking industry. And do you realize there is absolutely no requirement that anybody detect, mitigate, or remove malware from the electric grid?
The SolarWinds hack was, and really continues to be one of the biggest espionage campaigns recently discovered.
I truly believe the next geopolitical conflict will either play out in the form of a cyber war or will involve some major cyber component. And the country that wins that conflict will look a lot like a digital Israel, a country that can continue to run its most basic functions and services while surrounded by hostile neighbors and hostile activity. And right now, the United States is not that country. We would lose that war.
I'm convinced that at some point or another, it's going to happen. The Chinese are in, the Russians are in, and the Iranians are believed to be in. They could wreak untold havoc. I was told that by the former chief scientist of NSA.
The head of U.S. intelligence, Dan Coats, said publicly that the Russians were in the control plane of our power grid, and the Chinese had access controls of our natural gas pipeline system.
Do you think that adversaries of the United States have the capability right now to shut down the power grid?
Yeah, they do. I mean, I think that there are very malign actors who are trying, even as we speak. There are thousands of attacks on all aspects of the energy sector and the private sector generally. I mean, the meat plant, for example. It's happening all the time.
The cyber threats facing this country are growing. With dramatic advances, potential aggressors are exploiting vulnerabilities in our security.
Is we are seeing millions of security incidents on our critical infrastructure every single day. We have caught Russia hacking into our grid, probing our nuclear plants. We've caught China hacking into our pipelines. I covered those attacks. We just declassified a report that said that the goal of those pipeline breaches was to get a foothold in the event China would need to knock out our pipelines one day.
We need to prepare for the consequences of a cyber attack. We are not ready. Tom Ridge, who was the first Secretary of Homeland Security, said to me, you know, we are not a preemptive society. We react to events.
There are days when I look at my 3-year-old and I wonder what the future will look like for him. We have never been closer to a cyber-induced cataclysmic attack on our critical infrastructure.
There's no plan. There are plans for hurricanes, there are plans for snowstorms, there are plans for earthquakes. There is no plan for a cyber attack that would be infinitely longer in duration and more widespread than any of those natural disasters.
A lot of people, when they think of a nuclear war, what comes to mind is the image of mushroom clouds, cities laid to waste. But that may not be the way a nuclear war actually looks today. So if you detonate a nuclear weapon 200 kilometers or higher in outer space, people on the ground might not even know that it happened. But it will send an electromagnetic pulse charge down and damage all the components critical to the electric grid.
An EMP pulse is a very dangerous threat, and it's a realistic threat. It's something that would basically, if you're not nuclear hardened, it will basically shut down any digital computer that is operating in the range of the EMP. So if you set off an EMP, a high altitude burst EMP, basically every light in this hotel is going to go off, every computer is going to go off, every cell phone is going to go off. That's what an EMP does.
From a very low yield nuclear detonation from a very simple small missile or even a weather balloon launched up 20 miles above the Earth can be absolutely devastating to the transformers and the rest of the electrical infrastructure.
So I was asked, is Stratcom ready to respond to an EMP attack? And the answer is yes, because we have nuclear hardened satellites, nuclear hardened command and control shelters. We can respond to that. But our nation as a whole has not really looked at the critical infrastructure that could be damaged by EMP. And we need to kind of take a look at that entire threat.
I ended up on an assignment at Norton Air Force Base, the Pentagon, came to the program office and told us that we had a new threat that they had not known about before, but was extremely serious and actually was rendering our missile system, the Minuteman, totally impotent until we fixed it. There was I call it a crash program, and I was picked to be the project manager to get the missile deployed as a hard missile. We actually know that the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians have in their war plans the first strike plan to take out our electrical power system with an EMP attack. It's not speculation. We know that. We learned it about the Russians when the USSR collapsed. There were a number of defectors that left Russia and came to the United States. So they showed up here with boxes, suitcases full of data showing what the Russians planned to do with an EMP attack, what the Russians had given in information to the Chinese. We've listened to Kim Jong-un of North Korea threaten an EMP attack.
They launched a ballistic missile off of a vessel in the Caspian Sea successfully. There is no other reason to launch a ballistic missile from a ship than for the EMP purposes. So these actions are very alarming and points to the fact that they're quite aware of EMP and our weaknesses to protect ourselves.
The thought that they could destroy tens, if not hundreds of millions of Americans and effectively take the United States out by detonating a single nuclear weapon, not even very precisely, but just somewhere in space over the middle of this country.
These are fanatics who believe that the demise of America and the destruction of Israel will trigger an event where the last Islamic Messiah will appear, kill the rest of the infidels, and then Islam will rule the world. And that's where the danger lies. Iranian scientists have been present in North Korea when North Korea detonated a nuclear bomb, and they are jointly working together for arming their missiles with a nuclear warhead.
Too often the U.S. seems to have two modes of response to a problem. Before the problem occurs, the U.S. ignores it. After it occurs, the U.S. tries to throw enough money at it to put things right. The trouble is, if the power grid goes down, there isn't going to be enough money and time in the world to get it working again.
Well, you know, if 9/11 didn't teach us anything, then I don't know what will, because the next attack on U.S. could be the end of America.
If there was a system-level EMP attack today, what would be the survival of the electrical grid system?
Really wouldn't survive at all.
It would not survive.
Right.
There are these non-nuclear EMP weapons. There's an item called the EMP suitcase, and it looks just like a suitcase. It can be operated by a single individual with little or no training. We've arrived at a place where a madman, a terrorist, a criminal could topple the technological pillars of civilization for a major metropolitan area all by himself.
Today, we have two satellites that were launched by North Korea, one in 2013 and a second one in 2016. They're on a polar orbit from south to north and cross the United States several times a day. We've monitored those satellites since they've been launched, and there's never been any data sent back from those satellites. That means one of two things. Either they were both total duds, or they are weapons waiting for a signal to drop a nuclear weapon.
Not only is Russia playing around with these capabilities in Ukraine, they're playing around with attribution. They're seeing if they could launch an attack on a system and not immediately be blamed for it. And when you can't tie back an attack to the actor, how do you respond?
We know we have been hit with what they call them sunspots. Coronal mass ejections is a more scientific term. The earliest we have of a massive coronal mass ejection dates back to 1859. It was called a Carrington event. And you think, well, we didn't have electrical power then. Well, we did have a telegraph system, and our telegraph system was fried coast to coast, and even in Europe. Sent telegraph operators to the hospital. It burned up equipment.
This threat has now silently grown to where it is perhaps one of the largest natural disaster scenarios that the country could face, that society could face.
How likely is it that we're going to have a storm of the severity, let's say, of the Carrington event? I don't think it's a question of if we're going to have such a storm, it's a question of when.
We did a lot of geomagnetic storm studies, assessments we call them, where we looked at specific power grids, we looked at their past experience during storms, and we looked at future in terms of what might happen. We did work for countries of Norway, Sweden, United Kingdom, parts of Japan, and almost all of that early work was done overseas because most U.S. companies weren't particularly interested.
We're extremely vulnerable. In fact, we've been designing the power grid for decades without any awareness of this threat environment. Essentially, we're playing a game of Russian roulette with the sun.
we're at a juncture here where we can do it right and get the protection built in, or we're in for a train wreck.
I can give you 1.2 billion reasons why this has not been fixed, and that is the $1.2 billion that the electric utility industry has spent in the last decade lobbying our federal Congress, along with political contributions to members of key committees that could enact legislation to protect the electric grid.
Nobody wanted to take responsibility. So the Department of Defense, for example, would say, well, an EMP from the sun is a natural threat, so that belongs to the Department of Homeland Security, and that's not our responsibility. The Department of Homeland Security would say, well, an EMP can be caused by a nuclear weapon or non-nuclear weapons, by terrorist attack, and so that's a DoD responsibility. And the Department of Energy, that is responsible for overseeing the electric grid, would say, national security isn't our problem at all, so it belongs to somebody else, not us.
Anytime we've seen anyone put forth, even bipartisan legislation that would mandate that utility companies meet this very basic standard of cybersecurity, it has always been knocked down by lobbyists. But the reality on the ground is that a lot of these utilities are managing these tangled webs of software. Most of it hasn't been updated in a decade.
They don't want the inspections that would come. They don't want the oversight that would come with government. They want to continue to regulate themselves and be opaque.
When the commission and others of us who've been raising the alarm about this have asked the question, don't you have children? Don't you have people that you want to assure survive? And the answer, of course, is whether they're government bureaucrats or whether they're electric power utilities executives, yes, they do. And yet the inertia, the intention that it'll be somebody else's problem, it won't happen on my watch, is so profound.
The chairman of the Critical Infrastructure Protection Committee of IEEE USA once made some comments about how other countries such as Israel and the UK have appointed a single champion to be in charge of protecting their electric grids. He made a comment that in America, it's Waldo. Where's Waldo, right? And that's true. There is no one person who's in charge of the protection of the U.S. electric grid.
The president could designate somebody, give them the resources, give them the mandate to actually get out there and fix our grid.
I think it's appropriate and important for California to make a statement about this. This measure urges the president and Congress to work together to implement grid hardening measures to help ensure our nation's critical electrical infrastructure is protected from threats of electromagnetic impulses and physical attacks on the infrastructure.
So just because there have been many in the electric power industry who have fought against grid protection initiatives doesn't mean that the whole industry is opposed to this. We've seen some electric utility industry members take good actions. We've seen Dominion Power has done a lot to secure its infrastructure against physical attack. Duke should be commended for its work. CPS Energy in San Antonio, Texas is another one that should be commended. People have thanked me for my service as a Marine, and there's nothing that I ever did in uniform that would compare to the service provided by those people who work hard to keep electricity flowing.
The way we have got to fix the electric grid is by holding the electric utility industry accountable for making sure that the grid is protected against these threats, and we have to hold the U.S. government and the state governments accountable to make sure that happens.
It's not that we don't know how to protect grid assets from these threats. The U.S. Defense Department has for decades protected important strategic systems such as our nuclear weapon systems and communication systems against nuclear electromagnetic pulse. There are military standards that show exactly how to do this.
John Houston of CenterPoint Energy charged his engineers with coming up with mitigation measures for EMP. CenterPoint, using Siemens Ciprotec protection devices, worked with Siemens to develop a compact, scalable digital substation protection and control system that can survive EMP, IMEI, and other hazards for a fraction of the cost to create an entirely new substation. That's a success story, and we're happy to say it's already available. Unfortunately, despite the availability and affordability of EMP mitigation measures, utilities have been slow to retrofit their substations.
We know exactly what to do. We know how to do it. We know that it's not very expensive, and we know it can be done in phases depending on what level of protection we want. What we need to do is start with those things that are hardest to replace. Our large transformers, we start by protecting them, protecting substations, protecting the transmission, the generation, the fuel supply.
Microgrids enable us to get away from some of the real vulnerabilities, like huge high voltage transformers and these big power lines.
We could evolve away from the big grid. Every city could have its own independent power source. It would also change the politics of electric energy in a way more responsive to the people.
People of San Antonio are really the ones that own their own grid. This is a municipally owned electric utility. Joint Base San Antonio, through the leadership of Lieutenant General Stephen Quast and the Electromagnetic Defense Task Force, established a pilot project in San Antonio. And right now, there are courageous military officers in San Antonio working with engineers at CPS Energy to protect that grid against all hazards. It's the first of its kind in its country.
Essentially, you do not have to be vulnerable to the fact that you use electricity. San Antonio can say, hey, businesses around the world, come to San Antonio, and we will give you clean power, and we will give you resilient power where nobody can take it away.
Searching for a place, York County was an obvious place to come. So I went to the electrical engineering department at Clemson University, my alma mater, and asked for the names of graduates at Duke Energy. They provide electricity to all of York County. Together, we agreed on working the problem from the bottom up.
The good news about this project and about studying EMPs is that it is fixable. The preliminary studies that we've done show for about $100 per citizen that you could easily take care of these type situations. So as we look forward into how to make those investments, I think that's something that's probably well deserving of people's attention and the funding towards that.
We know what needs to be done. It's just a matter of a will to do it. And the question about what's it going to cost? What is the price of the loss of life as we know it today? What price tag do you put on that and compare it to the few dollars that would be spent?
The people have to contact their elected officials from the local level to the state level to the national level. We cannot afford not to do it because look at the damage and look at what's going to happen if we don't. So get educated, get a call to action.
I want to start taking action as quickly as possible. We have for far too long talked about developing a strategy to develop a plan and start doing something concrete to start mitigating what could be a horrific catastrophe. I never want to be sitting here in the dark saying I told you so.
People need to stand up and encourage their representatives to demand that we lock up our critical infrastructure.